That's it. Good morning. Hello. Strange to say good morning, actually, and welcome to Books and Beer. It's my pleasure to welcome to Books and Beer live today, Alan Baxter, all the way from Australia. Hello. My first
Oh,
Australian on the show, in fact, mate. Would you?
is
It's
that right?
amazing.
Oh,
Yeah,
good.
yeah,
Excellent. Oh, well, I'm
yeah.
glad to be popping your Australian cherry.
There you go. There you go. Yeah. Are you Australian? In fact, I know you're not Australian by birth. I read on your website that you're
No,
you're
I'm
an
actually,
Englishman.
I'm actually, yeah, English, British by birth.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
you
I
grew
grew up
you
in the
grew up
UK.
quite. You're a
Moved here
southerner as well,
when,
aren't you?
yeah. Well, my family, I'm a bit of a mongrel in terms of the British Isles, actually. My mum's family are London for generations. But my dad's side are a mix of West Country, Cornwall, Devon, and West Highlands of Scotland. So
Oh
it's all
wow.
kind of a bit of a mix and match. But personally, I was born in Sussex and grew up in Surrey, and yeah, then moved to Australia. So yeah.
Wow. I grew up near Hastings, so not a million miles from you.
We used to go down to Hastings a lot. We get on the bike, get on the motorbike, and ride down to Hastings just for the sake of it, hang out down there.
Yeah, yeah, that's it. Brilliant. Not as nice as the beaches you have near you now, I imagine, or not as sandy at least.
Exactly. Yeah, a little bit warmer to swim, a little bit sandier on the beach.
That's it. That's it. So you have written so many books. Do you even keep track? And do you even know how many, what number there are?
Well, it I'll be honest because I could just answer and go, yeah, I know. I actually know because somebody asked me recently and I didn't know. And so I had to check.
Okay.
But the third Eli Carver book, which are sort of these supernatural thrillers like organized crime, mad, high octane supernatural thriller things, the third one of those just came out. That's my 25th book. If we
Nice.
include the books I co write with David Wood, because Dave and I
Yeah.
have written 8 novels together. So 25 or 17 if you count just my own.
I think you can count the collection. I count my
Yeah,
my joint ones with other people. So yeah, for the
yeah,
sake
I
of
think
this
it's
show, yes, you can. When did
yeah.
it all start for
Basically,
you
there's
then?
25 books with my name on the cover. That's what it comes down to.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. When and how did that begin then? When was your first sort of right? I'm going to write a book. I'm going to do this. You know that inspiration.
It's well, it comes down to when I sort of started traveling. I'm just trying to think of the way to sort of tell the short version of this. So basically, I grew up in the UK. I was never super like into school or anything like that, but I was mad for martial arts since I was like knee high.
Mm.
And it got to the point where all I wanted to do was train, fight, as mostly in competition, I should add, like tournament and stuff like that.
Yeah, not in the
And so
streets.
I left school when I was about 17, and I got a crappy admin job that was a straight up 9 to 5 job that just paid a regular wage, and that meant I could just pay my training fees, fight on the weekend, not think too much about it, which I
Mm.
did for like I don't know, close to a decade. And I was playing. I used to play in a band, and I basically that was all I did. I did music and kung fu, and that was cool. And then I sort of hit this point throughout that time. I was writing, and I used to do a lot of role playing games. I used to play a lot of Dungeons and Dragons and Warhammer and Shadowrun and all those cool games, where I used to be the games master more often than a player, so I could tell the story. Um, and then it sort of got to this point where I just felt like I was in a real rut, wasn't sure what I was doing with stuff, and I kind of hated the 9 to 5 thing and wasn't sure how to shake it up. And a friend of mine who lived in Australia said, "So when you're going to come and visit?" And another friend of mine about the same week said, "I want to go traveling, but I don't want to go on my own." And I was like, "Well, this sounds like a sign." So
Yeah,
basically, I just
yeah.
long story short, I just ended up packing up, and for 2 years, I was just walking around with a backpack and a guitar all over the place.
Amazing.
The large part of that was visiting my mate in Australia, and a large part of that became meeting the girl who subsequently became my wife. Um, and during that time of traveling, I realized I've been writing stories all this time. I was always into storytelling. I was a passionate reader and everything else. And while I was traveling, I realized actually I want to write stories. I want to try and do that properly. Why do I
Mm.
just like fuck around with this without really like trying to take it somewhere? I've never actively tried to get published before or anything like that. So while I was traveling, I made that decision. I'm actually going to try and give this a go.
Mm.
And that was when I started writing. The first time I was writing with a view to publication, and that was the book that actually was Realm Shift that actually became my first novel. So I kind of made that decision, and in my mid-20s when I was traveling, even though I'd sort of been writing all along, it was this conscious thought that I'm not just going to go back to England and go back into that rut. I'm going to do something. And I ended up emigrating to Australia, marrying an Australian girl, joining a whole entire new Kung Fu school, started a writing career. So it was a real shake-up. Yeah.
Yeah, I bet it was. I do think there's a sort of mental shift there, isn't there, between I'm just writing what I feel like writing to
Yeah.
I'm going to finish a book and I'm going to get it out in the world. However that might be, I don't know yet, but I'm going to do it. You know,
Yeah.
it's like an invisible line that you cross.
Yeah. I'd written numerous books I hadn't finished. I had bits and pieces of all sorts of books. I had loads of stories that I'd written out, and I was always just kind of playing around with things. And I've never done that thing where I went, I'm going to write and finish something good enough to publish. That, you know, it wasn't for a long time, but that was the plan. And then and so that it was that conscious decision while I was basically walking the earth like Kane in Kung Fu, figuring out what the hell I was going to do, and that's what I decided to do.
I like it. I like it. So now your life sounds fascinating. Oh, before we get on with this, we need to talk about drinks. I just saw you take a sip there because you're on the beer, not beer, but the alcohol this afternoon, aren't you, or this evening? Very nice. Very nice.
I finished work, finished teaching, and got in. It's what is it now? Just after 9 o'clock at night. So I'm enjoying a scotch. So cheers. I know
Absolutely.
it's a bit early.
Cheers. Cheers. No, I'm having a coffee. I have to say, apologies for that. But yeah, it would. I'd just go back to bed.
So instead of books and beer, you get books and whiskey in the morning.
Absolutely. Yeah. I didn't think that when I named the show because I thought at that point it was just me when I named it. It was just me on my own talking to readers and having a chat about what I've been doing that week. So I could do it at any time of the day. But then when I started talking to people from all over the world, it sort of changed slightly. But the name's there and I quite like it.
Yeah, I like it. It appeals to me immediately.
Exactly. What's not to like? So your sort of lifestyle then of Kung Fu teacher in the daytime and then novelist in the evening, or however you split your time, is quite a fascinating one. Do you find that both sides of those sort of bleed into one another? You know, that you're
Yeah, I mean they are sort of diametrically opposed, and that sort of makes them complementary. Like I spend half my time sitting still, hunched up, making shit up, and the rest of my time going bonkers, physically busy. So, which is better than all one or all the other, I think. But it took a long time to sort of build this position, because even when I came to Australia and I married my now wife and I was trying to take writing seriously and stuff, I still needed to make money, and I still had the sort of 9-to-5 admin job, which was the only sort of thing I was really qualified to do at the time. But then I got my dad to thank. Basically, my dad got a dividend at work, and he said, here's some cash. And it was enough for me to afford, because I couldn't afford it before, but it was enough for me to afford which is like night school, basically, training. So I was over here, I was still teaching and training Kung Fu with the new school, but I still had to have the sort of 9-to-5 job. And my dad gave me that little bit of money that made me able to afford to pay for retraining, and I retrained as a personal trainer. And I got all my sort of fitness and personal trainer qualifications, and then pivoted out of the office and ran a personal training business, which was great because it got me out of that 9-to-5. Even when I came to Australia, I think for the first 4 years or so that I was here, I was still doing that crappy job that I hated. But then I pivoted into doing the personal training, had a much more sort of physical day job, even though, mornings, evenings, whatever. And I created time where I was teaching or training Kung Fu. I was dealing with clients in the gym or groups in parks and stuff like that. And in the gaps in between, I was writing. So it basically meant that I was kind of all the time I was awake, I was doing something. But it made me able to create that space to do those two things. And then that went on for many years, for probably a decade or so. And then we moved out with this. I was living in Sydney at the time. We wanted to buy a place. There's no way we could afford Sydney prices. So we moved a couple of hours south of the city. And so when we moved down here, I moved a little bit away from the personal training, set up a new Kung Fu school down here, and then started building just the Kung Fu training and the writing. And so it's a transitional process over like 20 years to sort of get where I am. But I'm very fortunate that I'm able to do those two things now.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Because I always find, I mean, I do a combination of things: DJing, writing, podcasting, these sorts, and people always say, which one would you like? What's your favorite? And it's hard to decide because sometimes I like this, sometimes I like that. Others, it's the
Yeah.
variety that's the beauty of it, in my mind. Do you know, is that how you sort of feel about it? It's the change.
There's definitely a good benefit to it. If I wasn't doing the kung fu, I would be sitting. My wife calls this the cave. She's like, "Oh, you're off into the cave." Like, yeah, tapping away, making shit up. And it's like if it
Grunting.
wasn't for the kung fu, I'd spend most of my time in the cave. So it's great to get out and be around people and other stuff as well, as much as it's
Yeah.
good physically. But also, kung fu's just been. It's a lifestyle. It's not just it's not just a job or a hobby. It becomes very much a lifestyle. I've done it since I was a preteen,
Mm.
and I often say it would be really nice if I made a good enough living as a writer that I didn't have to run the kung fu school. But
Mm.
even if that was the case, I would still do it because that's
Yeah.
what I do. It would be nice not to have to, because with the balance of money, and I could be a bit more pick and choose about how many classes I run each week or whatever. But despite the possibility that it would be nice not to have to, I would still do it because it's very much a part of who I am. And so these things are very sort of complementary and interwoven. And the art of writing and the martial arts, they're very similar. There's more similarities than dissimilarities, strangely.
That's interesting. What are those similarities then between the art? This isn't necessarily author related, but how are they comparison? Are you talking about sort of becoming a master of a craft? Is that the sort of avenue that you're
Yeah, to some
thinking
degree,
about?
definitely. They both require a lot of discipline. They both require a lot of self-reflection. They both require
Mm.
a dedication to a craft and a desire to continuously get better at that craft, and a knowledge that
Mm.
you're never going to reach the end of it. There's not going to be any point to go, right, I can do that now, because no
Yeah.
matter how long you do it, you can always be better at it. You're always going to be striving for something more. It's something that sort of informs the way that you live your life, becomes a part of your personality and who you are. And the fact that I'm a writer and a martial artist is sort of intrinsically woven into me. It's not like I can really remove either of those. And even if I stopped running the Kung Fu Academy tomorrow, I would still be that martial
Mm.
artist. I would still have that mindset, philosophy. I would still do that training for my own benefit. I would still do that thing. So yeah, it's they very much complement each other.
Yeah, I can see that. I like that. I think there's quite a poetry in there actually. I think you could.
Yeah, it's
I
a
can
yin and
see
a
that
yang
coming out in
activity
a
and
character
yeah,
in the
expression.
future. Yeah. So let's talk about then your writing and how your martial arts inform that writing. You talk about, I mean, you write characters who fight and kick people's butts and do these sorts of things. Does it make it quite difficult, I suppose, because the fighting has to be a specific way? You can't just have them throw a knockout punch and be done with it. There's got to be, are you more fussy about those scenes, do you think, in your in
Yeah, I
in
can be.
your
I
sort of
can be.
attitude?
It really bothers me when people write really sort of inauthentic or unconvincing fight scenes. It can really pull me out
Yeah.
of the book. Um, like certainly not everything I write has fights in it or is sort of focused around fighting. A lot of I've had more than 100 short stories published, and the
Mm.
vast
Oh wow.
majority of short stories don't have fighting in them.
Yeah.
But I wrote a lot of sort of horror and dark fantasy stories that explore all sorts of things. My novels definitely tend to have a bit more in terms of action and conflict and fighting. In particular, the Alex Kane series
Mm.
is very much focused. The main character is a career martial artist, and so that really is the book where it's all sort of horror and dark fantasy and a badass martial artist main character. Um, and that series came about because people were sort of frequently saying, "Oh, you write such great fight scenes." And people who knew
Yeah.
me as an author but didn't know much else about me were like, "Oh, your fight scenes are so good. Why are your fight scenes so good?" And it's like, well, other than writing books, that's all I know. That's what I do. Um, and so it sort of occurred to me that I really ought to write a series focused on the martial arts, focused on someone who is a martial artist, and that's where the character of Alex Kane sort of emerged from. And so subsequently I wrote what I thought was a standalone novel. By halfway through the novel I realized actually this is quite bigger, and it became a trilogy. And that got published by HarperCollins here in Australia back in 2014. That was first published, I think. And so that's the one that's just jam-packed full of fights. And as the series goes on, the adversaries just get tougher. Like Alex gets more and more powerful, and the adversaries turn from people into monsters, into he ends up fighting all manner of beasts and creatures, and ends up going head to head with elder gods and all sorts of stuff. And so that was very much born of the fact that I was sort of developing a reputation for writing good fight scenes. And I guess that's because I get fighting. I love the action. I mean, you can see, which way is my camera going? That way.
I can see some swords and things and
so
stuff
there's
on the
Enter the
back.
Dragon up here, which is the Bruce Lee movie, one of my all-time favorites. It's like there's that. I'm really kind of influenced a lot by movies and graphic novels, as well as by the reading that I've done, and I love to try to get the excitement of those excellent sort of fight scenes on the page. And you can't transcribe a movie fight to a book because it doesn't work. The mediums are different. A movie is, you're outside it, it's two-dimensional, it's turn-based. In a book, you're inside it, and real fighting is not like movie fighting. And so I wanted to get that sort of excitement into the writing, but I wanted it to be authentic as well. I wanted it to be realistic for people that understood fighting, and even people who don't understand fighting and they don't know why, they can tell that it's authentic. They can tell there's something about it that's sort of realistic, and that's why it reads to them as good, because they're like, I can't say why, but this is really good. I like it.
Yeah.
And so that's what I'm always trying to sort of transpose into the page and get into the book, so people get that real visceral kind of fight scene action. And then there are books that have got no fights in them at all. So
Yeah. I mean, I think there is a perception, I think, in the sort of old kung fu films that there is often this sort of man versus self element to them, isn't there? Like, whilst there's an adversary in the physical sense, there's also this, as you've talked about in the martial arts sense, there's this, you're bettering yourself, you're developing, you're moving, you as a... Does that come across in your characters as well, that they are... Sometimes in our sort of genres, you can see characters that are quite, they're the sort of that Lee Child classic cut and paste hero that doesn't really have much depth to them, and people love that, and there's nothing wrong with that, but that's not how I try my characters to be. Do you find that, coming from that perspective is my question, I suppose, your characters are a bit more sort of self-reflective, or have a bit more depth and a bit more sort of...
I think you want a bit more three-dimensionality to characters, and for me it comes back to this basic principle of sort of storytelling, that something that I learned a long time ago, and have really tried to always sort of hold on to, which is this difference between plot and story. And where plot is what happens. This happens, this happens, this happens, this happens. That's the plot. Can be really good ideas, can be really exciting. But that's not the story. The story is why we give a shit about the plot. The story is why we care. And that's usually, almost always, in the characters, because if you're invested in the characters and you care about them and you care about how they respond to the plot, then that's the story that you're looking for. So for me, it really is about, however much, like with the Eli Carver series, it's just balls to the wall action. It's high octane, it's gunfights, it's mad mob action, it's car chases. But at its heart, it is still very much about Eli Carver and him trying to take back control of his life, and how he's developing and growing while he's being haunted by these ghosts of people that he's killed and stuff like that. Because you need to care, even with an anti-hero like him. He's fundamentally not a great guy who's trying to be better, but you kind of need to care. It doesn't mean you have to agree with them, but you need to empathize with them. You need to understand their motivations, and you need to kind of feel invested in their future. And that's when you care about a story. And so when characters are a bit two-dimensional, it can be an interesting read. It can be a sort of a popcorn read, but all you've really got in that is plot. There's not much story. Whereas story is when there's other stuff happening as well, when there's more going on. And then then you've got deeper characters, and then you've got more actual story, and then you give more of a crap about what's happening, and you feel a bit more invested. And for me, they tend to be the more sort of three-dimensional stories and the more interesting. The read keeps you engaged at a deeper level.
Yeah.
Hopefully, this is what I'm aiming for. How successful I am, I don't know, but this is what I aim for.
No, I know what you mean, and you've talked there about your character having a sort of flaw or being real, And I talk to people on the show a lot about that. The idea that I think all of us try to make our characters relatable. They're not shiny superheroes. They are real people who have vices, who have made mistakes, who have done things that they're not so proud of, or whatever. And then you put them in a challenging situation and sort of see how that unfolds.
Yeah. I mean, everybody is flawed. We are all flawed in one way or another. And for me, the most interesting characters are the flawed ones. I do have a real soft spot for the anti-hero and the reluctant hero and those kind of vibes. For me, that stuff's a lot more interesting.
Yeah.
And I really enjoy writing, and I really enjoy reading the characters who are like, I don't want to be here. This is messed up. Why is this happening to me? Kind of idea.
Yeah.
But they've got to push through anyway. Eli Carver is like that. Alex Kane is like that. A lot of the characters that I write are in that sort of position. And especially because so much of my stuff, there's a lot of fantasy, crime, thriller and stuff that I do, but the majority of my stuff at its heart is horror. And I love that. I love the honesty of horror and the using that to sort of put something in front of people that really makes them reflect on themselves and how the hell are they going to deal with this situation? How the hell are they going to deal with this thing? And then despite their flaws or, because of their flaws or whatever, they push through. So
that's really interesting, isn't it? And I think horror can be sort of misconstrued in a way. I mean, I wouldn't say I'm a horror reader, but I have read some books, I'm sure, that fit into that. But they're essentially studies in the human, really, aren't they? Rather than the horrible things that happen, they're the study of the reaction of that person, or the resolve of that person, or how they get through that
Absolutely. Like horror is a really broad church as well. A lot of the time, you say horror and people go, oh, and you see them glaze over, and they're just thinking of 80s slasher movies.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
people think about knives and blood and gore and whatever, and that's a part of horror. Sure, there are, and there's some great. I mean, Stephen Graham Jones has just released a book that's basically just leaning right into the idea of the slasher genre kind of thing. Is definitely a part of horror, and Stephen Graham Jones is just one of the best writers working today. It's an amazing book. But horror is really broad, and it doesn't. You can have some really unsettling and disturbing horror that doesn't have a drop of blood in it. A lot of my stuff runs the gamut from like some really full-on stuff to some really subtle and quiet stuff. But what it is that horror is always this idea. It's basically trying to build up this sense of unease and this sense of the uncanny. And a good description as well that somebody once said is when you're facing the monster, that's not horror, that's terror. Horror is knowing the monster's coming, but you don't know where it is yet.
Yeah.
And that really sort of captures that sort of vibe. And horror runs the gamut of those things. And as I mentioned before, to me, it's a genre of honesty, because I always come across, when I talk about this, I suddenly sound incredibly nihilistic. I'm not. I've got a lovely family. I love life and everything else. But we're all heading in the same direction. We're all on the same journey, and we're all going the same place. Like, no one's getting out of this alive. So when you look at it like that, a lot of the time when we tell stories, and we always have resolution, and we always have happy endings, or we always have some sort of cut off before the real darkness kicks in, which is good. We need those sort of stories. They're an essential part of life. But what horror tends to do is push a bit past that. The heroes don't always win. Sometimes the monster wins. Not all the people do make it out alive, and all these sort of, if you start walking down a dark alley, if it's a horror story, you don't change your mind and turn back. You keep going, because you want the honesty of that total experience.
Yeah.
That's what I really enjoy about the genre, pushing deeper. And once you start down the rabbit hole, you keep going to see where it goes. And to me, that's the real interest in horror.
I think you're right, and I think if you look at sort of classic horror from the 1800s, Shelley and these sorts of things, it's exactly what you've described. It is a study of what happens if you push too far.
Mm.
Men and women pushed to the very extreme into a really dark place, and you see what happens. And in a lot of those books, you see actually sort of the outside force isn't it isn't a monster as you say, but it is to sound corny. It is life, or it is the environment, like the weather. You think about Frankenstein. It's ultimately the Arctic that kills the monster, or the monster wanders off into the Arctic. And
Yeah,
we don't know. And it's that sort of idea that I think comes through that genre that's
yeah,
interesting and powerful.
yeah. And a lot of the time, even with the most sort of initially what seemed like relatively superficial slasher movies, there is often a lot more going on under the surface if you sort of pay attention to a lot of the subtext of what's happening. I mean, you look at that's Friday the 13th, the Freddy Krueger movies.
Mm.
They're classic slasher movies, but they're an amazing study in agency and lack of control. When you fall asleep, you're not in control of yourself anymore. And it goes right through. And with that series, there's you come. I can never remember which ones are which, but you come Freddy 3 or Fred 3 or 4 is a really incredible sort of like homoerotic kind of subtext of that movie. And then
Yeah,
these films just explore so much more
yeah.
than the surface level of the story they're telling. And a lot of the time, I mean, look at Hellraiser. I mean, I've got where I say, oh my god, this one up there. I've got this
I know it's a bit
puzzle box
confusing.
up there and another one somewhere. There's one over my shoulder now that I can't move. I love the puzzle box and the lament configuration and the idea of solving puzzles. And are you going to push yourself to solve the puzzle far enough and know that you're going to unleash literal world of pain on yourself
Yeah.
because of it? But you have to push through. You have to keep picking that scab. There's it's really interesting how much of human nature these films actually explore.
Mm.
And there's just you've got the great horror entertainment and the jump scares and everything on the top, but there's so much more underneath. And when you do that, when the book version of these, like there's Hellraiser the movie, but the book that is based on the novella called The Hellbound Heart by Clive Barker,
Oh yeah.
it's so much more about love and agency and that sort of stuff than it is about Cenobites and the nature of pain and stuff. It books especially, we have this ability to delve so deep into the emotional core of characters. And in film, of course, it's film. You don't have that internal sort of
Mm.
monologue or dialogue. You don't get to go that deep. So films tend to be more superficial and more visual and more entertaining on that front. But the books go deep, and so horror literature is an incredible study in humanity.
Oh, it is. It is completely. I agree with you. I've never written one, but then I suppose that comes from my reading choices as well. It's never been my first choice to read a horror book, although from what you've said, I know there's some great books out there, and I've enjoyed them in the past. But I think, yeah, there is that sort of dark side that
Mm.
makes them interesting. But I think that the struggle in them is less physical, isn't it, than in a thriller or in a
Yeah, a lot of
mystery
the
or
time
whatever.
the struggle can be more sort of cerebral or more
Yeah,
emotional, even
yeah,
while you still have that actual physical action in the front of it as well. You can be fighting a monster, but it's often comes down to something else than the physical confrontation of what's going on. But the opposite is also true. A lot of the time, you have thrillers that at their core are they're horror stories in a way. Like
yeah.
Silence of the Lambs is very much a
That's
thriller,
true.
but that is most definitely a horror novel.
Mm.
You just depend. This is what when you start to realize that horror is such a broad church that it applies to so many things. There's it might not be mainly a horror novel, but it might be a thriller that definitely has horror aspects to it. And that's the
Yeah.
thing about horror. Horror and comedy, rather than being actual genres unto themselves, they're more like spices that you add to any other food. You can have
Mm.
science
Mm.
fiction and you can add horror. You can have a thriller, you can have horror, you can have fantasy, you can add horror. And same with comedy, you can add those things. And so this is where, it depends how much spice you put in as to whether it ends up being called a horror story or a thriller, a dark thriller or dark fantasy, or crime noir
No.
or whatever.
Do you decide that in advance when you're writing a new series or a new novella or a new short story or whatever it might be? Or do you sit down and you go, I'm going to write, and it turns up being sci-fi, whatever, horror, dark fantasy, it turns up being something, do you know in advance, I suppose?
I never really, going back, I never really thought of myself as a horror writer until other people started calling me a horror writer. And then I was like, oh, yeah, I guess that's true, actually. And, I grown up, the two things I probably read more than anything else, I mean, I'm a voracious reader, crime and thrillers and westerns and all sorts of stuff. I love all sorts. But the two things I probably read more than anything else were always fantasy and horror. And when I first started writing, I thought I was basically sort of a genre writer. I like this sort of dark urban fantasy, and it always had elements of crime to it. But then I realized that actually a lot of the stuff I write is really a lot darker than most of the other stuff in those sort of genres and in those areas. And the more I wrote, the more I worked, the more I just ended up drifting more towards the horror side of things. And yeah, it's just kind of seems to have just been this natural progression that I used to write, sort of dark fantasy and supernatural thrillers that were on the dark side, whereas now I tend to write horror that often has supernatural or fantastical elements in it. And it's wasn't really a conscious decision to do that. It just seems to be that just when I write things, they tend to just go dark.
Yeah,
Even
no,
when I don't expect them to or don't plan for them to, they tend to just keep getting darker. So I roll with it. Yeah.
No, that's the way to do it. And do you find then that you have a group of readers that read everything that you write, or do you have certain readers that just read certain things? What's your sort of, do they follow you around? Do you find there's different? Do you know what I mean? Do you know what I'm asking?
Yeah, there is. I think there's definitely a core group of readers who they're basically Alan Baxter readers, and so they tend to be like, if I put out a book, they grab the book.
Yeah.
So which is great, because I mean those kind of true fans, those real keen readers, that they really make the bedrock of helping to spread that word of mouth. Without word of mouth, our careers are dead in the water. But it does seem to be that around that sort of group of core readers, people come from, like, for example, with the books I write with David Wood, we have two series. There's the Jake Crowley adventures, which are sort of one reviewer wrote it as like Dan Brown, only good, which was which was a fantastic review. They tend to be these kind of occult action adventure thrillers. And we write the Sam Aston series, the Sam Aston investigations, which are basically monster thrillers. Poor Sam Aston always ends up trying to live his life and coming up against some other giant monster that he has to deal with. And so with those, there's some readers that have come from knowing my stuff. There's some readers that have come from knowing Dave's stuff. And there are some readers who are Jake Crowley readers or Sam Aston readers. And those sort of groups tend to bleed over a little bit into other things. I have some readers that found me with my urban fantasy stuff. And so the Alex Kane series or Hidden City, books like that, they really like, not really so aware of the horror stuff. I have other readers who are really into the horror. So they know me for the Gulp, or they know me for the Eli Carver thrillers and stuff like that. They don't realize I've got these urban fantasy trilogy out there and stuff like that. So it's kind of weird. But a lot of it just comes to it. A lot of it's sort of when people come into your work, or what sort of access point they find to your work. If someone gets recommended, say, the Gulp, then they'll know me as a horror writer. If someone gets recommended Alex Kane, they'll know me as an urban fantasy action writer. So I like to hope that those people, if they do enjoy that, will start looking into what else I've done and start having a dig around in the back catalogue, and will hopefully subsequently enjoy the other stuff I've done as well.
I think people are versatile. I know I am as a reader, and I think there are. I think people do read cross genre. I think there's this perception in the writing world to think that readers just exist within a microcosm of the books, that a micro category of things, you know. But I
Yeah.
don't think that's true. I think people do read all over the place. What's
Yeah,
your
I
go
don't
on?
think so.
Go on.
I read widely. I read broadly.
Yeah,
I love fantasy. I read horror. I read action. I read westerns. I like crime. Um, and I've said this before. Like, I never met a genre I didn't like when it came to writing. I tend to cram as many as I can into everything I do. And I don't know how true it is, but I like to think that by this point in my career, there's the vast majority of people out there are buying an Alan Baxter book rather than buying a horror or a whatever.
yeah.
And hopefully that my voice is developed enough that sort of whatever sort of genre angle I'm leaning in any particular book, it's still a book by me, and that's what's appealing about it. So hopefully, having done this for a while, my voice is developed enough that that's what's appealing. So
Yeah, I think that's true. I think
fingers
that's
crossed
probably
anyway.
the case, isn't it? What's your process for writing then? Do you plan it all out beforehand, or are I was chatting to Kevin Tomlinson a couple of weeks ago, and he says he makes up the title, then he sits at his keyboard, and the book comes out. Over the course of weeks or however long, over the course of a couple of months.
Yeah, I've had
But
some like
what's
that. But I like the George Martin analogy. George Martin of Game of Thrones fame. He said that writers tend to be architects or gardeners. And the architect is the person who'll plan everything out. They'll write the plan chapter by chapter. It's like a building. Before you lay the first brick, you know where the plumbing's going, where the wiring's going, how many rooms it is, and all of that. Whereas the gardeners are these people that have this sort of big picture idea, and they plant a seed here and there, and they water it, and they watch it grow, and then they sort of trim it, and they sort of let it go, and they let the garden sort of lead them.
I
Um,
like that. Yeah,
and in that respect, I really like that analogy, because and in that respect, I'm very much a gardener. A lot of the time, I'll have a good idea of what sort of thing I'm going to do, but until the writing starts, I'm not quite sure where it's going. So, when the seed comes up, I know if I've planted a tree or a carrot, but then when it starts to grow, I don't quite know how it's going to go, and I'll let it lead me on a bit. And I tend to find these days that a book for me will be more than one idea. Like when 2, 3, 4 ideas kind of crash into each other, it's, oh, hang on, that's good. That works with that, and that worked. And then I'll realize this is something I can work on. And I'll start writing, and I'll just let it go, and I'll feel. And by the time I'm about halfway through, I've started jotting down a few notes about where I think it's going to go. And they're more like sort of signposts along the way. I think this is where it's heading. And if the
yeah,
story leads me in a different direction, then fuck it, scrap the signposts. But
yeah, yeah. So yeah,
all the time that it's kind of following that guide, it kind of helps to grow. So I tend to start without much planning, plan a bit more as I go, and then just see what happens.
where does inspiration strike you then? Is there some place that you or sometimes for me it's reading other things or watching films or somehow engaging in a different story. I get an idea. I'm like, oh, that specific bit would be great if, and then it comes and it goes
Yeah.
through the percolation of the ideas, and things like that. Where do yours come from? Is it a similar
If
sort of
I'm
thing? I'm just
honest,
yeah.
if I'm
Keep going
honest,
on.
so in some cases I'll read something or watch something and be like, I could do that better. Um,
Yeah, yeah,
and it's not really that I really think I could do that better. That's their idea. That's their sort of thing. But it makes me think I could do something like that, and I reckon I could do a good job of it. Or it's like, I want to write a so and so novel. Like, I want to write a home invasion novel, or I want to write a cosmic horror thriller, or I want to, and I'll sort of and I'll be triggered into doing that. Um, a lot of the time, for me, a lot of stories come from these very small seeds. I might have a scene in mind or a particular character in mind, and like Alex Kane is a good example. That's an entire sort of dark urban fantasy stroke horror whatever thriller trilogy. It's like 350,000 words of story, and that initially excuse me, that initially came, the character of Alex Kane himself had been living in my head for months and maybe years, but I didn't have a story for him. And I knew I wanted to write this character, and the character himself had kind of formed in my head. And then there was a secondary character. Silhouette is this sort of shapeshifter chick that he that basically saves his ass repeatedly, is what it boils down to. She's just fantastic. And she started forming in mind, and I had these two characters in mind, but I didn't really have the story for them until I started thinking to myself, actually, I want to write basically the big fat fantasy quest, but I want to write it as a contemporary thriller. So the tropes of the big quest idea, but set here and now, and written like as a thriller pace, so like 100,000 word novel, not a 300,000 word novel. As it turned out, it turned into a trilogy, but it was a trilogy of like 100,000 words, not trilogy of 300,000 words. But that was that thing where those things were sort of coalescing together. And when I realized, I want to do that, and Alex Kane, that's the perfect character for that idea. I'm going to try to do that with that character. And so a lot of the time, that's how these things sort of come together, is I have ideas or scenes or characters or a very small plot ideas, and then several of them will kind of run into each other, and it'll be like, aha, okay, that's the book I'm going to write next, you know?
Yeah, it's a great process to be part of. Like, I've got some ideas now for my next one, and every so often the first idea is there, and then another one will form, and it sort of layers on top, and another one, and another one, and before you know it, it's become this thing that didn't look anything like the first idea to begin with, you know, because it's sort of merged out of all form.
Yeah, it's like this accretion of things until all of a sudden it gets enough weight that it starts rolling, and then
Yeah,
away.
that's it. And then you get excited about it, and you're like, right, I've got to write this now, you know.
Really interestingly, actually, the thing I'm working on right now
let's
was
talk about that.
triggered by a cover. So there's a cover designer who put up this sort of pre-made cover of a thing, because I do, you know, I work with lots of sort of different publishers in small press, and HarperCollins here in Australia and stuff, but I also do some stuff on my own. I do some indie stuff. And this an indie cover design, basically, where they do these pre-made covers. This guy threw up on Twitter this cover design and was like, hey, I was mucking around with this is cool. And I'd been playing around with this idea of something that I wanted to write, and when I saw that cover appear on Twitter, I was like, I want to write the story for that cover. And it was like that cover triggered for me the bit that was missing with this story idea. And so I basically contacted him, and I was like, can you delete that tweet? I want to buy that cover. and so now I'm writing the story to go with the cover, which was all these different ideas that didn't quite have this central premise until I saw the cover. And then I was like, oh, that's it. And it triggered enough for me to get that movement.
Brilliant.
And now that's what I'm writing right now. So
that is brilliant. What a great way to do it.
From so many weird and stupid places. No two books have ever been written the same way.
Yeah. Yeah, it's almost the thing that always surprises me is how unrecognizable the final, in my sense, the final thing is to what the initial idea was. I've got this idea that it's like this, and it's going to be like that, and then it turns out to be something completely different, you know?
Yeah, it's a real surprise to me when I write a book that ends up being kind of similar to what I envisaged. Because it is so rare. It is so often I picture something and that's what I start, and then by halfway through it's like, oh, okay, so this is the book I'm writing. So yeah.
That's it. How does it work with your collaborations with David Wood then? Are you because I've done some with Steve Moore, and we've tried various different things, and we're going to do another few and try it in a different way. And I'm always interested how other writers work those collaborations.
Well, when we decided to try it out, because originally Dave's got a really big following as a sort of real action adventure writer. There's like the Brock Stone, Indiana Jones kind of vibe. He does really great series, particularly his Dane Maddox series. He's incredibly popular. They're a great series of books. And I was doing like sort of the horror and dark fantasy stuff, and we decided we might be good to try to mix up what we do and basically appeal to both audiences to some degree, is what it comes down to. But also just that kind of that vibe would be a good combination and for some good storytelling. So initially we decided to write a short novel. It's called Dark Right, and it's basically our sort of homage to the Hammer horror B-movie kind of vibe. And it's like an Appalachian horror story. It's cool. It's good fun. And it would be a great movie. Producers out there who might be listening. But it was an exercise in how we would work together. And when we did that one, we kind of sent chapters back and forth, and we built it up as we went. And it came out to be a good book. It was good, and we liked it, and it did okay. And then we decided we would work on some more. And long story short, we basically came up with the two sort of concepts, like I mentioned before. The Jake Crowley adventures are kind of like the Dan Brown sort of action adventure, but there's always this kind of weird occult undercurrent to it. And the Sam Aston investigations, again, are like these sort of Indiana Jones action things, but there's always a big monster in it. But we've got to the point now where we'll nut out a story, we'll talk about it back and forth, and we Skype a lot, and we figure out what's going on, and we'll spend weeks and weeks talking over the next book and getting our head around what we're going to do. And then once we're kind of settled on the idea, Dave writes what we call draft 0.5, which will basically, and this is where absolutely we're planners, because we have to basically work together on this. And so I never do anything like this detail with my own stuff, but Dave will write basically a chapter by chapter outline of what we've kind of had in mind, and then he'll send that over to me, and then I'll write the actual first draft, and frustrate the hell out of Dave quite often by
changing it,
yeah, changing stuff or adding something. And I didn't like that, and this character felt a bit like this, so I've done that, and bloody okay, and now I've got to change it. But so he'll do that sort of 0.5, then I'll do the first draft, and then we'll have basically a first draft, and then we send the whole thing sort of back and forth a few times. He'll go through and he'll edit and change, and then he'll send it back to me, and I'll go through and do it again. That will bounce back and forth a few times until we're sort of happy with the finished product. And like I said, we're 8 books in or something now. We've got there's Dark Right, and then there's 4 Jake Crowley books and 3 Sam Aston books so far.
Wow.
So we've really kind of got our method working now, and it works well for us that way. So,
do you find it quicker or less quick, or takes longer when you're working with someone else?
When I'm working one of Dave's outlines, absolutely, I draft way faster.
Yeah.
When I'm writing my own stuff, I might from a novel length work, 80 to 100,000 words, which tends to be sort of general ballpark for most of my novels and the stuff with Dave. When I'm working on my own stuff, it might be 3 or 4 months for a first draft. When I'm working off one of the outlines from Dave, I'll put out that first draft in sort of 6 to 8 weeks usually. But that's also because we've spent several weeks talking about it, knocking it back and forth. Plus, they're both ongoing series, so I sort of know the characters well, which makes them easier to write. Plus, I'm working from Dave's outline, so it's much easier to get that first draft down. Whereas when I'm doing my own stuff, I tend to be a gardener, and I just sort of fuck around and see where stuff's going and make some notes and go back and change things. It takes 3 times as long, but they're different beasts,
And you do end up, when you do it in that way, I've found is there are bits that don't make the final cut, aren't there? You've written a scene, and then you realise it's not quite how it should be, and you've got to then take that out or change it,
Yeah, and there's a lot of working to the outline where we've talked about it a lot. It tends to be most of everything that you need is there. Whereas when I sort of build my own books and write as I go along, I'll have a lot of notes. I'll always get to the end of the draft, then I have to go back and put a lot of stuff in or adjust a lot of stuff and realize, okay, that turned out to happen. I need to go back and foreshadow that, or if that's going to happen, that thing in chapter 3 can't happen. And you have to do that kind of, you put the story up on blocks and kind of tinker about and knock it back into shape. So, yeah.
Yeah, I like it. Alan, this has been so much fun. I've loved connecting and talking books and drinking coffee and watching you drink scotch. It's been great fun. I'm actually talking to David next week, to be fair, on Wednesday at the normal time in the afternoon.
You're talking to David?
Which would be good.
Cool.
Yeah. I was supposed to be last week, and then he put me in touch with you in the first place and said, "Oh, you."
That's right. Actually, you're right.
And,
he did, yeah.
But then he couldn't make it last week, so he's booked in next week, which will be
when you
great.
When you talk to him, tell him to pull his finger out, because we need to start planning the next Sam Aston book.
Absolutely, for sure. Where can people find you and your books and everything you do? Where's the best place to go?
The best place, everything. I've got a big sort of website that's been sort of honed into shape over many years. So you can find that at alanbaxteronline.com. and you can sort of link to anything from there. Any book cover, click on it and you'll learn about it. All my social links are there as well. And I spend way too much time on Twitter. So ALANBAXTER. You can just find me there at Alan Baxter on Twitter. And yeah, just come and say hi there. I spend too much time on Twitter. I really like that platform. But so yes, anything you need to know about me or my books, start at my website. And if you want to say hello, find me on Twitter.
Thank you so much. And thank you for watching Books and Beer at home. I've loved having this conversation with Alan and you guys tuning in for it. If you're on YouTube, if you could like and subscribe, that's really, really helpful to me. And if you're watching on Facebook, like my page there as well. And make sure you tune in next week back at the normal time, 5 p.m. UK time, which I think is 1 p.m. Eastern. Was it midday Eastern? And then 9 a.m. Pacific, I think. Something like that. And if you're in Australia, Alan, you'll be fast asleep, but you can watch it.
Yeah, I'll be crashing.
you'll be fast asleep, but you can watch
I'll
it
catch it on
when
YouTube
you wake
later.
up. Absolutely. Alan, thanks so much. I'll see you again.
Thanks. Been fun. Cheers.